I am your host, Nero Wolfe. Let's begin our journey.
I was at my desk debating whether to tell Fritz that the mailman had looked at the spice delivery with suspicious intensity or just finish the bank reconciliation when the doorbell rang. It was 9:15 in the morning. To Nero Wolfe, a doorbell before 11 is not a summons, it is an act of war. He was currently upstairs in the plant rooms, likely telling a dendrobium that its petal structure was insufficient, and I knew better than to buzz him for anything short of a localized earthquake. I glanced at the monitor. The woman on the stoop looked like she had been put through a professional wringer. She was wearing a coat that had seen better decades and clutching a handbag as if it contained the secret to eternal life. She wasn't vibrating with importance like the usual Wall Street type. She was trembling with the kind of bone-deep fatigue that comes from working 14-hour shifts and still being told you missed a spot on the baseboards. I went to the door, slid the bolt, and opened it. Before I could even offer a polite good morning, she looked at me with eyes that were red-rimmed and hollow. "He won't see me," she whispered. It wasn't a question, it was a statement of fact based on a lifetime of being ignored. They told me he costs a fortune and only talks to kings. But I heard it, Mr. Goodwin. I didn't see it, but I heard the way he died. Mr. Wolfe is currently occupied with a bunch of temperamental vegetables, I said, stepping aside to let her into the foyer. But I am Archie Goodwin, and I've been known to listen to things for a living. You're the maid from the Henderson penthouse, aren't you? The one the papers are saying was unavoidably absent during the shooting. She walked in, her heels clicking softly on the marble. Her name was Maria Esperanza, and for the next 20 minutes, she sat in the front room and told me how she had been in the service pantry of the Henderson estate when the master of the house, a billionaire with more enemies than shares, had been silenced. The police had written it off as a professional hit-clean, quick and silent. But Maria had heard the killer speak. Not words exactly, but a sounder, specific, rhythmic clicking, followed by a phrase in a language she didn't recognize but would never forget. It sounded like a clock catching its breath, she said, her voice shaking, and then a whisper, like dry leaves. The police laughed at me. They said I was imagining things to get a reward. I told her to stay put, and went to the office to wait for the clock to strike 11. When the elevator finally groaned its way down, and the seventh of a ton of genius Nero Wolfe entered the room, he didn't even look at me. He headed straight for his chair, settled in with a sigh that moved the curtains, and reached for the mail. "There is a woman in the front room," I began. "No," Wolfe said. "She heard about the Henderson murder. The police think she's a crank, but she has a piece of information that hasn't been in the Gazette. A sound. A specific mechanical sound followed by a whisper." Wolfe opened a catalogue from a nursery in Zurich. "Murder is a noisy business, Archie. I am not interested in acoustic anomalies. She's a maid, Mr. Wolfe. She has no money, no standing, and no one to believe her. But she mentioned that the sound reminded her of the clock in the Bulgarian embassy foyer, the one you mentioned in that article about 19th century horology last month." Wolfe froze. His eyes, usually half closed in a state of perpetual boredom, sharpened. He hated being reminded that I actually read his scholarly diversions, but he hated the idea of a rare timepiece being involved in a homicide even more. "The Henderson penthouse has no Bulgarian clocks," Wolfe muttered. "It is decorated in the garish style of the nouveau rich." "Exactly," I said, leaning back. "So why did Maria hear one? And why did the killer whisper a phrase that sounds suspiciously like a line from the very book of poetry you were grumbling about at breakfast?" Wolfe closed his catalogue. He didn't look happy, but he looked interested, which is the same thing for him. "Bring her in, Archie. But if she is merely a woman with a vivid imagination and a penchant for reading my published articles, I shall charge her for the time it takes to show her the door." I went to get Maria. As I led her into the office, I noticed a black sedan idling across the street. It hadn't been 10 minutes ago. The brownstone's piece was already starting to fray at the edges, and I had a feeling that before the day was out, Wolfe would be wishing he'd stayed with his orchids. The office transformed the moment Maria Esperanza crossed the threshold. Usually, the transition from the front room to Wolfe's sanctum is a transition from the ordinary to the immovable, but today the air felt thin like it does just before a lightning strike. Maria didn't sit in the red leather chair, she hovered on the edge of it, her knuckles white as she gripped her purse. Wolfe, for his part, didn't even nod. He sat with his chin resting on his upper chest. His eyes narrowed into slits that suggested he was examining a particularly troublesome microbe. "So," Wolfe began, his voice a dry rumble that filled the room without effort. "You heard a clock, in a house that, according to the architectural digests, is furnished with glass, steel, and the vanity of a man who equated price with value. There are no mechanical clocks in the Henderson penthouse, Miss Esperanza. There are only digital displays and silent oscillators." "I know what I heard, Mr. Wolfe," Maria said, her voice gaining a sliver of steel. "I have worked in houses much older and much finer than Mr. Henderson's. My grandmother in Cuenca had a clock that sang before it struck. This was like that, a whir, a click, and then a heartbeat. Tick-thud, and then the whisper." Wolfe's fingers began a rhythmic tap on the arm of his chair. It's a gesture that usually means he's found a thread and is deciding whether to pull it or set it on fire. The whisper. Archie tells me it sounded like a poetry line. "Be precise." My ears are not for hire to those who generalize. Maria swallowed hard. It was not English, it was Zemia na moyata lubov. I remember because it sounded like the way my mother used to say land of my love in our own tongue. But the vowels were flattened, hard like stones. Wolfe went perfectly still. I've seen him react to many things outrageous bills, insults to his cooking, and even the occasional threat of arrest but ID, never seen him look quite like this. It was as if Maria had just dropped a live grenade on his desk, and he was admiring the casing. Zemia na moyata lubov, land of my loved, opening line of a Bulgarian nationalist anthem. "Archie," Wolfe said, his voice dropping an octave, "who was in the Henderson penthouse that evening?" "Besides the victim and the invisible assassin." I flipped open my notebook. The official list is short. Henderson was hosting a small strategy session. We have his young wife, Cecily, who was reportedly in the media room with the volume turned up high enough to rattle the windows. We have his business partner, Sterling Van Suho claims he was in the library. Then there's the personal physician, Dr. Aris Thorne, and a political consultant named Julian Actually. Let's call him Julian Hatcher, was there to discuss Henderson's potential run for the Senate. Maria was in the pantry, and the security guard was downstairs dealing with a malfunction in the service elevator. 4 people, Wolfe mused. 4 pillars of the community, each with a reason to want the mountain moved, and a maid who hears ghosts. "The police don't think I am a ghost, Mr. Wolfe," Maria interrupted. "They think I am a liar. They think I want to blackmail the family. But I saw the doctor's bag. It wasn't in the hallway where he said he left it. It was by the service door, and it was leaking." "Leaking?" I asked, leaning forward. "Water? Medicine? Oil?" she whispered. "Heavy, dark oil, like the kind they use for old machines." The doorbell rang again. This time it wasn't the tentative press of a frightened woman. It was the authoritative, repetitive jab of someone who owned the street and everything on it. I looked at the monitor. It was Sterling Vance and a man I recognized as a high-priced legal eagle. They looked like they were ready to sue the stoop for being too steep. "The outsiders are arriving in force," Archie, Wolfe said, his eyes shifting toward the door. "It seems the sanctity of this house is to be further compromised. Do not show them in. Let them wait. If they believe their time is more valuable than mine, let them contemplate that fallacy in the hallway. Miss Esperanza, go with Archie to the kitchen. Fritz will give you coffee and a place to hide. I suspect your unavoidable absence is about to become a matter of public debate." I led Maria toward the back, passing the office door just as the shouting started outside. Vance was demanding entry, his voice carrying through the heavy oak. He sounded like a man who was used to getting his way and was currently finding the lack of cooperation deeply insulting. I settled Maria with Fritz, who was already fussing over her with a plate of almond crescents, and then I headed back to the front. "The partners are getting restless, boss," I said, stepping back into the office. "Vance is threatening to call the commissioner. He says we're harboring a fugitive witness and interfering with a private investigation." Wolfe didn't look up. He was staring at the empty space on his desk where the Bulgarian poet usually sat. "Let him call. The commissioner knows my number. But before you open that door, Archie, consider this. The sound Maria heard was not a clock. It was a pneumatic silenced air pistol vintage 1924, manufactured in Sofia. It has a very specific mechanical reset, and it only whispers when the pressure is perfect. A Bulgarian hit piece in a Park Avenue penthouse, I asked. That's a long way for a ghost to travel. The ghost is already home, Archie. Open the door. Let us see which of these gentlemen has oil on his hands. I went to the front door and pulled it open just as Sterling Vance was preparing to give the oak panelling another workout with his fist. He was a tall, angular man with a face that looked like it had been planned out of a block of cold mahogany. Behind him stood a man who could only be a lawyer, had that specific way of looking at a rug, as if he were already calculating the depreciation value for a tax write-off. "Good morning," I said, leaning against the jamb. "If you're here for the orchid show, you're about 4 hours early and 100 floors too low. If you're here to see Mr. Wolfe, he's currently occupied with a very delicate problem involving a Bulgarian semicolon." Vance didn't smile. "We know the Esperanza woman is here, Goodwin. Harboring a witness in a federal homicide investigation is a felony. My attorney, Mr. Leibowitz, is prepared to file an injunction before your boss finishes his beer." "An injunction sounds like a lot of paperwork for a Tuesday," I remarked, stepping back to let them in. "Why don't you come into the office and tell Mr. Wolfe why you're so eager to get a domestic worker back into a crime scene? He's always interested in the civic-mindedness of the upper crust." I led them into the office. Wolfe didn't move an inch as they entered. He stayed settled in his chair, his eyes fixed on a point exactly 3 inches above Vance's head. He didn't offer them a seat, which meant I had to play the usher. I steered them toward the yellow chairs, leaving the red leather one empty. It's bad for the ego of a billionaire's partner to sit in the seat, reserved for the truly desperate. Within 10 minutes, the room was full. Cecily Henderson arrived in a cloud of black silk and Chanel No. 5, looking less like a grieving widow and more like a woman who had just realized her inheritance was tied up in probate. Dr. Aris Thorne, a man with soft, manicured hands and eyes that moved too quickly for a physician, followed her. Finally, Julian Hatcher, the political consultant, strolled in. He had the easy, practiced charm of a man who could sell a drought to a drowning sailor. "Now that the quartet is assembled," Wolfe said, his voice a dry, rhythmic thrum, "perhaps we can dispense with the legal posturing. You are here because a woman who works for the late Mr. Henderson heard something that does not fit the narrative of a professional assassination. You are also here because you are, each in your own fashion, terrified of what that sound implies." "That's preposterous," Cecily Henderson snapped, her voice like ice chips. "Maria is a simple woman." She was hysterical. "The police have already discounted her statement." "The police," Wolfe countered, "are looking for a man with a gun. I am looking for a man or a woman with a history. Dr. Thorne, you were the first to reach the body. You claimed the room was silent. Yet, you carry a bag that, according to Miss Esperanza, left a trace of heavy mechanical oil near the service entrance. Do you often lubricate your stethoscopes with industrial grease?" Thorne's face went a shade of grey that wasn't in the medical textbooks. That's an outrageous lie. My bag was in the foyer. I never went near the service entrance." "And you, Mr. Vance," Wolfe continued, turning his gaze toward the partner, "you were in the library, a room filled with first editions including, I am told, a significant collection of Eastern European history. Did you happen to hear a clock catch its breath? Perhaps a whisper in a language that speaks of lands one loves too much to leave?" Vance stiffened. "I don't know what you're talking about, Wolfe. Henderson was my friend. We were building a legacy of debt?" I checked my notes. "The firm's latest audit suggests that building was mostly done with other people's money. Money that Mr. Henderson was planning to pay back by selling off certain assets. Assets that you, Mr. Hatcher, were supposed to keep under wraps for the upcoming campaign." Hatcher smiled, but it didn't reach his ears. "Politics is a game of optics, Archie. Henderson had some eccentricities. His interest in Bulgarian antiquities was one of them. But it's hardly a motive for murder." "Everything is a motive when the stakes are high enough," Wolfe said, leaning back until the chair groaned. "One of you knows exactly what Maria heard. One of you brought a ghost into that penthouse. And one of you is currently wondering if the oil on your hands will ever truly wash off. Archie, show them the door. I have a luncheon to attend to, and I find the smell of collective guilt ruins the appetite." I ushered them out, watching the way they avoided looking at each other in the hallway. They were a circle of sharks who had just realized there was blood in the water, and they weren't sure if it was Henderson's or their own. As I closed the heavy front door, I looked at Wolfe. He hadn't moved. He was staring at the empty air where the suspects had been, his lips moving in a silent Bulgarian rhythm. "The legwork starts now, Archie," he muttered. "I want the history of that medical bag, and I want to know which of those men spent their youth in the shadow of the Balkans." The afternoon was the kind of humid that makes Manhattan feel like it's being steamed in a cheap dim sum basket. Wolfe, of course, was oblivious to the atmospheric pressure, having retreated to the roof to discuss the finer points of humidity with his orchids. That left me to hit the pavement. My first stop wasn't a penthouse, it was a dusty, cramped repair shop in a basement on West 22nd Street that smelled of ozone, old brass, and a century's worth of mechanical oil. The sign on the door said Kolev's Son Horologists, but the man behind the counter looked like he'd been there since the invention of the sundial. He was hunched over a dismantled carriage clock, a loop screwed into his eye like a permanent fixture of his face. "I'm looking for a specific sound," I said, leaning over the counter. A whir, a click, and then a heartbeat. Tick-thud, tick-thud. Usually associated with a 1924 Bulgarian air pistol, but Im told the mechanism is identical to the reset on a Stoichkov regulator clock. The old man didn't look up, but his tweezers froze for a heartbeat. A Stoichkov? Those haven't been in a private home in this city since the embassy moved in 48. Too temperamental. Too much oil is required to keep the seals from cracking. "What kind of oil?" I asked, pulling out the glycine envelope with the smear ID lifted from the Henderson service entrance. He took a sniff and made a face like ID offered him a rotten egg. "High-viscosity whale derivative mixed with graphite. It's the only thing that keeps the Bulgarian seals from perishing in the New York heat. But you won't find it at a hardware store. You have to know the right person, and who would that be?" "A man who values the past more than the present," he muttered, finally looking at me. There was a doctor, a young man years ago who collected the old diplomatic pieces. He came here for oil, said it was the only thing that could keep his inheritance breathing. I thanked him and headed for the medical district. Dr. Aris Thorne's private practice was located in a building that looked like it had been bleached for a week. The waiting room was filled with the kind of people who pay $500 just to be told. Thea, stressed. I bypassed the receptionist with a grin and a wave that suggested I was an old friend, and slipped into the hallway. Thorne's private office was at the end of the hall. I didn't knock. I've found that the element of surprise is better than a warrant when you're dealing with a man who has something to hide. I walked in to find him staring at a heavy mahogany case on his bookshelf. It wasn't a medical trophy. It was a clock, a tall, ornate piece of Bulgarian craftsmanship that looked like it belonged in a cathedral. "Beautiful piece, Doc," I said, making him jump nearly out of his skin. "Does it catch its breath before it strikes, or does it just whisper?" Thorne's face went from pale to a sickly green. "Goodwin, you can't just these as a private office. And that's a private clock," I noted, walking over to it. "The kind that needs a very specific type of oil. The kind Maria found leaking from your bag at the Henderson place. Why did you take the regulator to a crime scene, Doc? Or was it just the internal mechanism you needed? The part that can be fitted into something a bit more lethal?" "I didn't. I was Henderson wanted me to bring it. He was interested in the movements. He was going to buy it from me, a billionaire buying a dusty clock from his doctor at 2 a.m. I shook my head. "That's a weak one even for a Tuesday. You were there to deliver more than a timepiece. You were delivering a message." I left him shaking and headed to a bar near the Bulgarian consulate to meet a contact who knows more about political exiles than the State Department. 2 whiskeys later, I had the missing piece. Julian Hatcher, the political consultant, wasn't just a local fixer. He had spent 3 years in Sofia in the late 90s, working on a modernization project that ended with a vanished treasury and several prominent figures meeting very sudden, very silent ends. By the time I walked back to the brownstone, the shadows were long and the air was cooling. I had a doctor who was terrified of his own furniture, a consultant with a history of silent deaths, and a partner who was broke. But as I let myself in, I saw something that made me stop. The The small silver salt cellar that usually sat on the sideboard in the dining room was gone. In its place was a single brass gear, precisely 3 inches in diameter, resting on a lace doily. It was the subtle trespass. I walked into the office. Wolfe was at his desk, staring at the gear. He didn't look angry. He looked like a man who had just seen the first move in a grandmaster's opening. "The trespass has been localized, Archie," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "They have moved from the penthouse to our table. A grave error in judgment. Call Saul Panzer. I want the history of Dr. Thorne's inheritance, and I want it before dinner." I walked into the office to find Wolfe staring at that brass gear, as if it were a venomous spider that had just insulted his lineage. The missing salt cellar wasn't just a piece of silver. It was a part of the house's rhythm, a small but vital cog in the machinery of Fritz's dining room. To have it replaced by a cold, industrial bit of clockwork was more than a theft, it was a commentary. Someone was telling Wolfe that his world was just as mechanical and just as easily manipulated as the one Maria had overheard in the Henderson penthouse. "It's a beautiful piece of machinery," I said, leaning over the desk to get a better look. High-grade brass, hand-filed teeth. If I had to guess, it's the primary drive wheel from a Stoichkov regulator. The kind that makes a very specific whir before it lets the hammer fall. Wolfe didn't look up. His eyes were fixed on the gear, his lips compressed into a line so thin it was barely there. "It is an impertinence, Archie. To enter this house, to bypass your supposedly alert watch, and to rearrange my table, it suggests a familiarity I have not allowed. It also suggests that our intruder is not merely a technician of death, but an artist of provocation. I was only in the kitchen for 10 minutes with Maria," I reminded him, "and Fritz was in the basement checking the wine. Whoever did this knows the gaps in our schedule better than we do, or they were already here." "Precisely," Wolfe muttered. "The quartet of discord sat in this room. One of them stayed behind or returned while you were indulging in your afternoon perambulations. But consider the geometry. Archie, why the salt cellar? Why not a pen or a book or a piece of mail? Salt is the ancient symbol of hospitality and wit. To remove it is to declare the hospitality void and the wit challenged." I sat at my desk and pulled out my notebook. "Well, if we're looking at challenges, Dr. Thorne is currently shaking like a leaf in a gale. He's got one of those Bulgarian clocks in his office, and he claims Henderson was going to buy it. But the oil on his bag tells another story. Then there's Hatcher. My contact says he was the shadow of Sophia back in the 90s. He knows how to make people disappear without a sound. And Vance? He's broke. He needs Henderson's shares to stay afloat, but those shares are currently tied up in a widow who looks like she's already picked out her next 3 husbands. Wolfe finally shifted his gaze from the gear to me. The doctor provides the tool. The partner provides the motive. The consultant provides the expertise. It is a trinity of convenience. But trinity implies a balance, and there is no balance in this room. One of them is the pivot. One of them is the hand that moves the gears. "You think it's the widow?" I asked. Cecily Henderson didn't strike me as the mechanical type. She's more about the finished product diamonds, the silk, the quiet life. Do not underestimate the lethality of a woman who has spent her life being underestimated, Wolfe countered. But she lacks cultural resonance. The whisper Maria heard Zemia namoyata lubavis, not the language of a debutante from Long Island. It is the language of an exile, someone who has lost a country and replaced it with a ledger. The phone rang. It was Saul Panzer, calling from a booth near the medical records office. I took the call, scribbling as fast as I could, while Wolfe watched me with that infuriatingly patient blinking. When I hung up, I felt the pieces finally starting to click into place and, not with the sound of a Bulgarian clock, but with the heavy thud of a closing trap. Saul found the inheritance, I told Wolfe. Dr. Thorne didn't inherit that clock from a relative. He bought it 3 years ago at an estate sale, the estate of a Bulgarian diplomat who died under mysterious circumstances in a hotel in Zurich. And the man who handled the estate? A lawyer named Leibowitz, the same guy who was standing on our stoop this morning with Sterling Vance. Wolfe's fingers began their rhythmic tap on the chair arm. So the circle closes. The lawyer, the partner, the doctor, and the consultant. They are not a quartet, Archie. They are a firm. and they have made the mistake of trying to bill me for their services. He looked at the brass gear one last time before sweeping it into the desk drawer. Tell Fritz we will have the lamb at 8, and Archie bring Miss Esperanza back to the office. I wish to know if she remembers the smell of the whisperer. Not the words, not the sound, but the scent. A man who oils his own clocks cannot hide the evidence from a woman who cleans his house. The evening settled over the brownstone with a heavy, watchful stillness that usually precedes a thunderstorm. Wolfe was back in his chair, his eyes closed, though the slight rhythmic movement of his lips told me he was currently dismantling the alibis of our 4 guests and rebuilding them into a scaffold. Maria Esperanza sat across from him, her hands still trembling, but her gaze fixed on Wolfe, as if he were the only solid object in a world made of ghosts. "Miss Esperanza," Wolfe said, his voice dropping into that low, resonant frequency that makes the furniture seem to vibrate. "Archie has informed me of a leak. Not information, but substance. A specific oil used to preserve the ancient Bulgarian clockwork. When you heard the whispered words of the anthem, did you perceive anything else? A scent, a presence? Do not think. Answer with your senses." Maria closed her eyes, her brow furrowed in concentration. "It was not like the master's cologne. It was sharp. Like the smell of the subway after a rain, but with something sweet underneath. Like the flowers my mother used to dry in the rafters. Lavender, maybe, but old. Very old." I looked at my notes. None of the men we'd seen today smelled like a rainy subway station, and Cecily Henderson's Chanel No. 5 could have knocked a horse over from 50 yards. "Lavender and wet metal," I muttered. "That's a hell of a combination, Maria. You sure it wasn't just the kitchen cleaner?" "No," she insisted, her voice growing stronger. "It was in the doctor's bag when he brought it in later, but it was in the room before he arrived. It was in the air when the sound happened." The doorbell interrupted use not a jab this time, but a long, sustained ring that suggested someone was leaning their entire weight against the button. I went to the monitor. It was Saul Panzer, and he wasn't alone. He was holding a man by the scruff of his expensive wool coat, and from the way Saul's jaw was set, I knew we'd caught a live one. I opened the door, and Saul shoved the man into the hallway. It was Hatcher, the political consultant. His easy, practiced charm had been replaced by a frantic, sweating desperation. His tie was askew, and there was a dark, oily smudge on his cuff that hadn't been there 3 hours ago. "Found him sitting in that black sedan at the corner," Saul said, his voice as dry as a desert wind. He was watching the windows with a pair of Zeiss binoculars and trying to stay out of the streetlights. I figured he might have a message for the boss. I patted Hatcher down, finding a small, leather-bound notebook and a snub-nosed .32 that looked like it had never been fired. But it was the smell that hit Med's sharp, metallic scent of industrial graphite and the unmistakable, cloying undertone of dried lavender. "Step into the office, Mr. Hatcher," I said, steering him by the elbow. "Mr. Wolfe has been expecting a delivery, though I think he'd prefer the salt cellar to your company." Wolfe didn't look up as we entered. "Mr. Hatcher, you have a penchant for surveillance that is as clumsy as your attempt at interior decoration. Why did you return to my house to leave gear on my desk? Was the salt cellar not to your liking?" Hatcher slumped into a chair, his face a mask of exhaustion. "I didn't leave anything here, Wolfe. I've been trying to stop them. You don't understand the people Henderson was dealing with. This wasn't a business merger, it was a repatriation. Those antiquities Vance and Thorne were moving. They weren't just clocks and books. They were state records for the old Bulgarian regime. Records that could hang half the politicians in Eastern Europe to few in Washington too. And you?" Wolfe asked, finally opening his eyes. "The shadow of Sophia. Were you the protector or the predator?" "I was the middleman," Hatcher whispered, "until Henderson decided he wanted to be a hero. He was going to turn the records over to the State Department. That's why the whisper was used. It wasn't a poem, Wolfe. It was a sentence. The anthem is only sung at funerals in certain circles. And the sound?" I asked. "The click and the heartbeat?" "The air pistol," Hatcher said, his voice shaking. "It's a signature. It tells everyone who knows the history that the debt has been collected. But I didn't kill him. I was outside waiting for the signal. The signal that never came." Wolfe leaned forward, his bulk casting a massive shadow across the desk. "Archie, call them. All of them. Tell Mr. Vance, Dr. Thorne, and Mrs. Henderson that if they are not in this office within the hour, I shall provide Mr. Hatcher with a very long, very detailed confession to Signon that names them all as accessories to a crime against the state. And Saul stay by the door. I suspect the ghost is about to materialize. I reached for the phone, feeling the tension in the room tighten like a piano wire. The increased pressure phase was over. Wolfe had the pivot. Now, he just had to turn the wheel. The office felt like the inside of a vacuum chamber where the air was being slowly replaced by suspicion. Hatcher sat in the corner, a broken man who had realized too late that being a middleman in a blood feud is like standing between two moving trains. Saul Panzer stood by the door, as inconspicuous and dangerous as a coiled spring. I had made the calls, and now we were simply waiting for the victims of Wolfe's summons to arrive. Wolfe wasn't reading. He wasn't even pretending to be indifferent. He leaned back, his eyes fixed on the ceiling molding, his fingers interlaced over his central mountain. He was orchestrating the doubt, letting the silence of the brownstone do the work that a rubber hose does in a police precinct. When a man knows he's guilty of something, silence isn't quiet. It's a list of his sins being read back to him in his own voice. First to arrive was Sterling Vance. He didn't bluster this time. He walked in, saw Hatcher, and his face went the color of a rainy sidewalk. He sat down without being asked, his hands flat on his knees, staring at Wolfe as if he were trying to find a crack in the granite. "Mr. Vance," Wolfe said, his voice a mere murmur that nonetheless commanded the room. "You have spent a great deal of effort trying to convince me that your partner's death was a matter of professional interest. Yet, your firm's ledgers suggest a more personal urgency. You weren't just losing money, you were losing your soul to a ghost from Sophia. Did you find the gear I placed in my drawer to be a fitting substitute for the salt cellar you removed?" Vance blinked. "I didn't take your salt cellar, Wolfe. I haven't been back to this house since this morning, and I certainly didn't leave any gears." "Indeed," Wolfe mused. "Then perhaps it was Dr. Thorne. He has mechanical aptitude and oil. Or perhaps Mrs. Henderson, who has the most to gain from a husband who becomes a legend rather than a whistleblower." Cecily Henderson entered then, flanked by the lawyer, Leibowitz. She looked at Vance with a contempt so pure it was almost beautiful. She didn't look at Hatcher at all. She took the red leather chair, one I usually save for the person who's about to be measured for a shroud, and crossed her legs with a whisper of silk that sounded like a serrated knife. "This is a farce, Mr. Wolfe," she said, her voice steady. "You've gathered us here to play games with clockwork and poetry while my husband's killer is still at large. If you have a point, make it. If not, I have a funeral to arrange." "A funeral is a very convenient conclusion, Mrs. Henderson," Wolfe countered. "But a murder is a beginning. It begins with a sound. A whir, a click, and a heartbeat. Dr. Thorne, you are late. Please join the circle." The doctor shuffled in, looking like he hadn't slept since the Eisenhower administration. He saw the brass gear on Wolfe's desk, which I had moved back into the light, and he actually whimpered. He sat on the edge of the furthest chair, his medical bag clutched to his chest like a shield. "Now," Wolfe said, his voice suddenly sharp, "we have the full complement. The partner who needs the money, the widow who needs freedom, the consultant who needs the silence, and the doctor who needs the tools. One of you entered this house 3 hours ago. One of you moved through that hallway, avoided Mr. Goodwin, and left a signature of death on my desk. Why? To frighten me, to warn me off, or to frame another member of this charming group?" He looked face to face, his eyes landing on each of them like a physical weight. "The gear is from a Stoichkov regulator, a clock that Dr. Thorne owns, but one that Mr. Vance and Mr. Hatcher have both handled. It is a piece of machinery that requires a very specific oil, an oil that smells of graphite and, curiously, lavender." I watched them. Vance looked confused. Hatcher looked terrified. Thorne looked ill, but Cecily Henderson, she just smiled. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of someone who had already calculated the odds and found them in her favor. "The lavender," Archie, Wolfe said, turning to me, "is the key. It is not an industrial scent. It is a domestic one. It is used to mask the smell of age, decay, and the things we keep hidden in the rafters. It is the scent of a woman who knows how to clean a house and how to hide a whisper." He turned back to the group, his voice dropping to a whisper that filled every corner of the office. The person who killed Henderson did not do it for money. They did it for the land of their love. And they are in this room right now, wondering if I have realized that the salt cellar was not stolen. It was merely moved to the one place I would never look. The office had become a pressurized chamber, the kind where the slightest tremor could cause the whole structure to buckle. Wolfe sat behind his desk, his massive frame as motionless as a mountain, yet his eyes were darting from face to face with a predatory precision. Sterling Vance was chewing his lip. Dr. Thorne was clutching his medical bag as if it were a life raft, and Hatcher was slumped in his chair, a man who had seen his own ghost and didn't like the cut of its jib. Only Cecily Henderson remained composed, her gaze fixed on Wolfe with a cold, aristocratic detachment. "You speak of hospitality and salt, Mr. Wolfe," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a razor. "But you have yet to produce a killer. You have a maid who hears echoes, and a collection of men who are clearly terrified of their own shadows. If this is the extent of your genius, I suggest you return to your orchids and leave the investigation to the professionals." Wolfe didn't blink. "The professionals, Mrs. Henderson, are looking for a Bulgarian assassin with a silenced air pistol. They are looking for a Cold War ghost. I, however, am looking for a strategist who realized that the best way to hide a murder is to wrap it in a legend, to use a specific sound, a specific phrase, and a specific tool that points directly to a history that everyone in this room is desperate to bury." He leaned forward, his hands flat on the desk. "The Stoichkov regulator is a masterpiece of mechanical timing. It requires a high-viscosity oil mixed with graffiti, a substance that leaves a lingering metallic scent. But the lavender Maria smelled, that is not found in a horologist's shop. It is in a linen closet. It is used to preserve the very fabrics that muffle a gunshot." Wolfe turned his gaze toward the door. "Saul, if you please. Bring in the evidence of the second trespass." Saul Panzer stepped forward, holding a small, silk-lined box. He opened it to reveal the missing silver salt cellar. It wasn't empty. It was filled with the same dark, oily graphite that had been found at the crime scene, but it had been mixed with dried lavender buds. "I found this in the service pantry, Mr. Wolfe," Saul said, his voice level, tucked behind the cleaning supplies. "It wasn't stolen from the house. It was used as a mortar and pestle to mix the scent that would frame a doctor and a consultant." The room went dead silent. Dr. Thorne looked like he was about to faint. Hatcher groaned and buried his face in his hands. "You see, Dr. Thorne," Wolfe continued, his voice dropping to a low melodic thrum, "the oil Maria smelled was not from your bag. It was from the person who stole your bag 3 days ago to plant the evidence at the penthouse. The person who knew that your interest in Bulgarian antiquities would provide the perfect smokescreen for a domestic execution. The whisper Zemia na moyata Lubovwaz, not a nationalist anthem. It was a taunt, a phrase used by a wife who had spent 10 years listening to her husband's obsession with a country he had never visited, while he ignored the woman standing right in front of him. Cecily Henderson didn't flinch. A lovely theory. But I don't know the first thing about Bulgarian clocks or air pistols. I am a woman of simple tastes, Mr. Wolfe. Simple, perhaps, Wolfe countered, but precise. You didn't need to be an expert. You only needed to be a student. You watched your husband, you watched his partner, and you watched the doctor. You learned the rhythm of the house and the rhythm of the weapon. And when the time came, you acted with the cold, mechanical efficiency of a Stoichkov regulator. You didn't leave the gear on my desk to frighten me. You left it to see if I would follow the path you had laid out. You wanted me to find the oil. You wanted me to find the lavender. You wanted me to hang Sterling Vance for a crime he was too cowardly to commit. You have no proof, Leibowitz, the lawyer interjected, though his voice lacked conviction. I have the salt cellar, Wolfe said, gesturing toward the box, and I have the fingerprints that will inevitably be found on the internal mechanism of the gear. Not the ones on the outside thos, or wiped clean but the ones on the axle. The ones left by a person who had to take the clock apart to understand how it worked. A person who didn't realize that in this house, even the salt has eyes. Cecily Henderson stood up. She didn't look like a widow anymore. She looked like a general whose flank had just been turned. She looked at Wolfe, then at me, and finally at the silver salt cellar. A clever man, she whispered. But a man who spends his life in a chair will never understand the need for movement. My husband was a fool, Mr. Wolfe. He was going to give away everything for a sense of duty to a dead world. I simply ensured that the world remained buried. She turned toward the door, but Saul Panzer didn't move. I stood up, my hand near my shoulder holster. The office gathering was over. The truth was out, and the air in the brownstone was finally starting to clear. The room didn't explode with a confession, it simply withered under the weight of Wolfe's logic. Cecily Henderson stood by the red leather chair, her silhouette sharp against the oak-panelled walls, looking like a statue of a goddess whose temple had just been desecrated. She didn't cry, and she didn't scream. She simply reached into her small, beaded evening bag, pulled out a cigarette, and waited for me to strike a match. I didn't. In this house, we don't reward the talent for murder with a light. You speak of Bulgarian anthems and mechanical resets, Mr. Wolfe, she said, her voice dropping into a register of chilling calm. But you forget the most basic element of any merger, leverage. My husband was a sentimentalist. He wanted to play the hero by exposing Vance's shadow and Hatcher's ghost. He was going to dismantle the firm, the fortune, and my future to satisfy a conscience he only discovered after he turned 60. Wolfe didn't look at her. He was looking at the brass gear, his fingers tracing the air above it as if he were feeling the heat of its friction. A conscience is rarely a convenient passenger, Mrs. Henderson, but it is a stubborn one. Your husband's intent was to hand over the Stoichkov records to the authorities. You, however, had already negotiated a much more profitable arrangement with the very people those records would have incriminated. Vance gasped, his mahogany face turning a sickly shade of grey. Cecily, you were talking to the Sophia group? I was talking to anyone who understood that information is the only true currency, she snapped, finally looking at the partner with utter loathing. You were drowning in debt, Sterling. You were going to drag me with you. I simply chose to swim. Wolfe shifted his weight, and the chair gave a sharp, disapproving creak. She didn't just swim, Mr. Vance. She navigated. She used Dr. Thorne's obsession with the regulator clock to provide the signature. She knew that if the murder looked like a political assassination, a whisper, a specialized air pistol, a Bulgarian anthem police would look toward the Balkans, not toward the bedroom. She even went so far as to ensure Maria Esperanza would be in the pantry. A witness who hears but does not see is the perfect tool for a strategist. She provided the ghost for Maria to fear. The lavender, though, I added, leaning against my desk. That was the slip-up. You used the salt cellar to mix the graphite and oil because it was the perfect size for the task, and you did it in the service pantry here, while the rest of the group was busy being insulted by Mr. Wolfe this morning. You thought the smell of the cleaning supplies would hide it, but you forgot that Maria knows the smell of this house better than you do, and she knows the smell of your linen closet at the penthouse. Cecily looked at me then, and for a second I saw the predator behind the pearls, a maid's nose and a detective's vanity. A formidable alliance. Vanity had nothing to do with it, Wolfe thrummed. It was trespass. You brought your crime into my office. You moved my furniture. You attempted to use the sanctity of this brownstone as a laboratory for your deceptions. That is an intellectual insult I do not overlook. He nodded to Saul Panzer, who had already reached for the telephone to call Inspector Cramer. The air pistol is in the false bottom of your vanity case, Mrs. Henderson, the one you left in the front room with your wrap. I took the liberty of having Saul inspect it while you were busy telling me how simple your tastes are. It still carries the scent of graphite and the lavender. The silence that followed was absolute. Leibowitz, the lawyer, stepped away from his client as if she had suddenly become radioactive. Dr. Thorne buried his head in his hands, and Vance just stared at the floor, a broken man who had realized his legacy was built on a foundation of blood and oil. Cecily Henderson didn't wait for the handcuffs. She sat back down in the red leather chair, crossed her legs, and stared at the clock on the wall. It was a beautiful sound, Mr. Wolfe, the click and the whisper. It was the only honest thing in that penthouse. The truth is rarely loud, Madam, Wolfe said, picking up his book once more. But it is always audible to those who know how to listen. Archie, show the gentleman out, and tell Inspector Cramer that if he arrives before I finish this chapter, he will have to wait in the hallway. I have had quite enough of the world's noise for one day. I ushered them toward the foyer, the circle of suspects finally broken. The reveal was complete, and as I heard the sirens beginning to wail in the distance, I knew the brownstone was about to get its silence back. The front door had finally clicked behind Inspector Cramer and his somber procession. The sirens had faded into the distance, leaving 35th Street to the hum of passing taxis and the long, amber shadows of a New York sunset. Inside the brownstone, the air was beginning to circulate again, scrubbed of the metallic tang of graphite and the cloying, deceptive sweetness of Cecily Henderson's lavender. I walked back into the office and found Wolfe exactly where I had left him. He hadn't moved a muscle, but the tension had drained out of his massive frame, replaced by the heavy, brooding stillness that usually precedes a monumental appetite. The Stoichkov gear was gone from his desk, likely tucked away by Saul for the district attorney. The red leather chair looked strangely vacant, as if it were trying to forget the woman who had just occupied it. "Well," I said, leaning against the doorframe and stretching my hamstrings, "that's for books. A billionaire silenced by a Bulgarian lullaby, a doctor who's going to need a very good lawyer to explain his clock collection, and a widow who almost made us believe she was a masterpiece of grief. Are we billing the Henderson estate, or do we send the invoice to the Bulgarian consulate for services rendered to the state?" Wolfe didn't look up from his book. "The estate will suffice, Archie. Mr. Thayer, rather. The executors of the Henderson fortune will find my fee a small price to pay for the preservation of what remains of their dignity. As for the consulate, I have no desire to become a footnote in Balkan bureaucracy. I have had quite enough of land of my love for one lifetime. You have to admit, though," I remarked, crossing over to my desk to close the ledger, "the salt cellar was a bold move." She actually sat in our front room and mixed a murder cocktail while we were 10 feet away. It takes a certain kind of nerve to treat Nero Wolfe's pantry like a laboratory. Wolfe closed his book with a definitive thud. It was not nerve, Archie. It was predator arrogance. She believed that because she had mastered the mechanics of a clock, she could master the mechanics of this house. She failed to realize that while a gear follows a predictable path, a mind does not. She saw the salt cellar as an object. I saw it as a displacement. He looked toward the dining room where Fritz was already moving with the silent, rhythmic grace of a man who knew exactly what the evening required. "Is the lamb ready, Fritz?" "It is, Mr. Wolfe," Fritz replied from the doorway, his face beaming with the relief of a man whose kitchen was once again his own. "And I have prepared the endive salad with the walnut oil you preferred. The table is set with the salt cellar," I asked, grinning. Fritz nodded solemnly. "The silver has been polished, Mr. Goodwin, and I have ensured there is no lavender anywhere near the seasoning." Wolfe stood up, a monumental effort that always looked like a tectonic shift. He paused at the edge of the desk, his hand resting briefly on the wood. "Vanity, Archie, is a heavy burden. Mrs. Henderson thought she could muffle the world with silk and whispers, but she forgot that the truth has its own resonance. It cannot be silenced by an air pistol or hidden in a linen closet. It eventually demands to be heard. Anne Maria?" I asked, following him toward the dining room. "She's still in the kitchen. She's terrified to go back to that penthouse." "She will not go back," Wolfe said, his voice dropping into a rare tone of genuine consideration. "I have already spoken to Mr. Pearson at the Knickerbocker. They are in need of a housekeeper who understands the value of silence and the importance of detail. She will find the environment less acoustic." We sat down at the table, the silver gleaming under the chandelier. The brownstone felt solid again, a fortress of logic in a city of chaos. Wolfe took his napkin, tucked it into his collar, and looked at the platter Fritz was presenting. For a moment, the murders, the spies, and the Bulgarian ghosts were 1,000 miles away. "You know, boss," I said, reaching for the water pitcher, "I think I'll stick to digital watches for a while. Less oil, fewer whispers, and no nationalist anthems at 3 a.m. Wolfe helped himself to a generous slice of the lamb. "A wise choice, Archie. Precision is a virtue, but when it becomes an obsession, it leads to the gallows. Now, if you please, let us discuss the endive. I believe Fritz has finally captured the exact degree of bitterness required to balance the walnut." I looked at him, the man who lived in a chair and ruled the world, and I realized that the only thing more precise than a Stoichkov regulator was Nero Wolfe's appetite for the truth, or maybe just for the lamb. Anyway, the case was closed.